Welcome to our project on force torque feedback for precise object placement. I'm Osher. I'm a third year student here studying EECS and physics. I'm interested in control theory, artificial intelligence, and just making cool robots. My experience is in reinforcement learning, robotic arms, and self-driving. I myself struggle with object manipulation, so it's a problem I really care about. And I can rip stick.
I'm Zach. I'm a second year studying Mechie and EECS. And as you can tell by Mechie coming first, even though this is an EECS class, my first love is hardware. So I'm most interested in design and construction of like robot hardware and tools. However, just because of the barrier to entry, most of my relevant skills are in software, so programming, control, optimization, and CV. So this project is sort of in my wheelhouse. I also do research in Professor Ken Goldberg's Auto Lab, and you can see that on the right, what I'm working on. So it's essentially mechanical search, which is just looking for an object in clutters. And, outside of work, I play Cal ice hockey. So come watch us play in the fall, the Oakland Ice Center.
Yeah, and I'm Michael. I'm a second year EECS major with interest in control theory, machine learning, and electronics. Specifically, I enjoyed doing projects that kind of bring the two together. So kind of like the intersection of like electronic hardware and software. I've taken 127, have some background with like signal systems and AI in both classes and side projects. And I've built motion planning software in my last job over the summer. And I've worked on robotic systems that operate underwater, on land, in air, and almost built a satellite. And then I enjoy backpacking and rowing. So to start with a project overview. Yeah, so the main question we're trying to answer is like, how can we reactively stack unstable objects? So we kind of got the inspiration for this by thinking about, the thing you do when you're like backpacking and, you take some rocks from the trail and try to stack them, see how high of a tower you can get. And we were thinking about how we as humans go about solving this problem. And there was a lot of reactive feedback, kind of feeling out the rocks, feeling how they sit. And that's important in making sure like the tower is like stable. So we want to try to emulate this on a robotic platform. So this is why we focused this problem on like stacking rock or like rock-like objects, since they have like relatively simple surface geometry. But you can still get like a lot of variation, and it can still be like a pretty challenging task. So yeah, we believe that the key to successfully stacking these rocks is going to be by incorporating feedback in the form of like forces and torques on like specifically the wrist joint. So yeah, we're going to be focusing on sort of like trying to find a control policy that will basically command the forces and torques that we observe on the wrist, such that we can get into like a known stable position before we let go of the object. So the first part of this is the perception pipeline. So here we're basically going to be limiting vision to coming up with an initial guess to our placement. So no detailed depth maps or anything of that sort. And we'll be using a wrist-mounted force torque sensor to perform most of the job of actually finding a stable placement position. So once all the forces and torques cancel out on the force torque sensor, then we can assume that like, if we let go of the rock or the object, it will more or less like stay where we let go. And this will be like a stable position. So here's a little diagram of what we're imagining. So basically we're going to have a parallel jaw gripper with two soft finger contacts. And we basically pick up a rock or rock-like object from a flat surface and then maneuver that over to like our placement position, use some rudimentary vision-based algorithm to come up with like an initial guess, which you can see in like the bottom left of this slide. And this initial guess might not result in like zero torque on the wrist, which would if let go in this position in the bottom left would cause the rock to kind of like slide around and fall off. So what we're going to build is an algorithm and a control system that will basically move the gripper, kind of experiment with different placements, hopefully not disturbing the bottom rock, but also finding like a solution that eliminates those torques and forces observed on the wrist. Yeah, so a basic overview of the algorithm we're thinking about making. We're planning to iteratively try like nearby placements on the rock, and assuming that's like a relatively continuously varying surface geometry, we could use some form of like gradient descent to kind of like narrow down on an optimal placement position, or at least a feasible one. And some of the considerations, we're going to have to keep in mind is, how do we explore this space without disturbing the bottom rocks? So especially as we build up higher towers, we want to make sure that, we're, observing this, surface geometry without maybe putting, undue force down on like the bottom rock or the rock below the one we're trying to place, because that might cause the tower to tumble. And how can we accurately make those fine adjustments? And then, balancing those two things with like adequate exploration, and, avoiding, potentially, pseudo or like quasi-stable local minima. So our experimental plan is to start in the simulator and then translate our approach to hardware, and start with using like more simple rocks, cubes, ovoids. And then as we get a better feel for this problem, generate some like adversarial examples, and kind of see like where it fails. And then applications, you could see this in potentially in situ construction, so it's like drywall construction or dry stone stacking, which is the picture on the top right, and then mitigating failure in particularly the place aspect of like pick and place, especially if you're like moving delicate objects. And then, you could also see, a lot of applications where the robot needs to interact very delicately with like people, or in like a game or like artistic setting.
All right, yeah. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what has already been done in this area. And so, as you might have expected, people have looked at rock stacking in the past, but generally it has been from a vision standpoint or deep learning standpoint. So the first paper we want to look at is this paper on stone stacking, where essentially what they do is they use a depth camera to get a geometry of each of these objects to the best of their ability, and then essentially try to stack them in simulation, and then the gripper goes ahead and tries to, essentially match that to the best of its ability. However, it doesn't use tactile sensing, and it's not able to recover from modeling or estimation errors, which is a drawback, especially in situations like Mars, for example, if we wanted to do in situ construction, where your vision would be not so good with sandstorms, and or you could have issues with like the rocks being especially unknown. Okay, another paper we looked at is with learning. There's actually two papers built into here. There's similar ideas in simulation. They're trying to stack these stones into a wall, and they essentially use a learning method to figure out where's the best place to put down the rock. However, it's a little bit unclear how they would transfer to real, because the first paper, Deep Q Learning, essentially finds all of the actions in sim and then creates the rocks they had in sim, and then just says, do the exact joint angles that you would have done to do the motions that you wanted to do in sim. So essentially it has no reactive feedback, and it has no ability to, deal with real objects without us. And the second paper is entirely in simulation. However, we could potentially use something like this learning method as a warm start for our optimization, essentially to get the starting point that Michael mentioned earlier. Okay, and then the third paper that we looked at, or the fourth paper that we looked at, is stacking with tactile feedback. And this is actually the bubble gripper that we saw in the paper presentations. And they're actually able to stack glasses like this, which is pretty incredible. One of the things you do notice, though, is the flat base surfaces. The fact that they're using a complicated gripper, which is specially designed for this purpose, as opposed to a general parallel jaw gripper, which Professor Goldberg, as you might remember from lecture, mentioned, is should be able to do most of the things that other grippers can do. And the other things to note about this gripper is, while it is very cool, it is bulky and it may have trouble in tight spaces. And if we are out in Mars, for example, It might not be as robust to sharp rocks or wear and tear, and may wear down more quickly.
Okay, so this is our current plan for the timeline. Around day 2 on this graph is today. We've finished our ideation project proposal, and now we have all these tasks ahead of us that we're going to lay out in detail. To get this project done, we have to build the code infrastructure. To do it, we have to continue developing the theory, and we want to iterate on our approach to come up with better and better algorithms based on the evidence that we see, to minimally solve the task we need, and then go into improvements. And if we have time, we have some future directions we want to try. Like we said, we want to try with more and more complex objects, and then we want to move to real life from simulation. So in order to get all of this done in a limited amount of time, we're going to start as simple as possible. We're going to do rapid iteration, and we're going to record our intermediate results so we can use those to inform our approach. Roadblocks so far that we found is precise robot control is really hard, especially with the current technology. As we know from our grasping project, any imprecision or noise is going to seriously hurt our performance in this task, since it requires very precise maneuvering. And sensing the wrench has been our biggest problem, because the sensors for force torque sensing are really expensive and inaccessible. And we have a choice of where to mount the sensors, and we thought through this with the TAs. And at the end of the day, we determined that wrist sensors are the best way to go. We also are looking for a good simulation for this. We think modeling the compliance with the gripper is pretty critical for this task. So something like soft fingers, or just noticing as weight is continuously moving from the gripper to the place where you're placing an object. So we found Grasp It to be a better simulation for this task.
So as Osher mentioned, one of the first steps in this project is hardware acquisition. We need a good robot, as mentioned before, that will have no shake. It will have to be very precise. So unfortunately, such robots are expensive, and so is the force torque sensor we need to mount on them, which could be upwards of $5,000. So we've done a bunch of research on trying to figure out who at Berkeley owns a force torque sensor. So we first tried 106B staff, and unfortunately, they would not buy us a $5,000 sensor for $50. We asked Professor Goldberg, and we reached out to Professor Baichi and Professor Agagino, who we've seen we did some research, and we found papers by them that use force torque sensing with the UR5 robot. We haven't received any responses back from Professor Baichi or Professor Agagino, but we intend to send some more follow-up emails, send some emails to Isabella Huang, who lectured with us, and Professor Abil, who is also a co-author on one of the other papers.
Okay, so the next steps from where we're sitting are to resolve this hardware access situation. We want to keep developing our theory for the control loop of balancing. And we can also start developing the ROS architecture for every other part of the pipeline. And we also want to set this up in our simulation environment. We want to figure out what is the rough computation time of our algorithm, and what scale can we use for our control loop frequency as constrained by our sensors as well. That's going to really matter. We're going to look at the kind of failures we see once we start running this, and use those to qualitatively inform how we improve our algorithm design. And we're going to, in doing that, we're also going to compare different objects. We can see what kind of objects fail in which ways. When we add sensor noise or disturbance like wind or cable rumbling, as time permits, we have many possible extensions. We want to do more and more complex shapes, maybe even soft objects, maybe working with soft grippers. We want to measure our resistance to noise and disturbances. And what would be really cool is if we can do multi-object plans when we're stacking rocks. And ultimately, maybe even we can do a dynamic environment, such as transferring an object to a human hand.
Eeks, my first love is hard. All right, so
You want to fix that?
is precise object placement with force torque feedback. So I'm Michael, Zach, and Osher. Yeah, so what sort of inspired us to this problem is we're thinking like, there's a lot of work on like picking stuff up, but it seems to be less work on like actually placing it down. And the work that has been done on like actually placing objects, a lot of it uses vision. So like some of the prior work you were looking at, especially with regards to like this problem of like stacking stones or like stacking various objects, they just use like a 3D depth camera, get like the center of mass or like some like potential like placement points with the camera, and then just sort of like take the arm and then like put the object on top with like no like tactile feedback or like force torque feedback to actually tell you whether that's a good placement. And trying to think through like how we go about placing things. If you're like stacking rocks on a backpack trip or something, it's more than just looking at the rock and like oh, I think this is the spot that I need to put the rock, and just put it there and like see what happens. This feedback where you sort of like put it on like the bottom rock, and you sort of like move your wrist around, get like a feel for like how that like changes the torques, and then once those like torques zero out, then you're at like a stable placement position, and you can actually let go of the object. So this potentially has like more applications as well with like dealing with like other robots or like handing off objects to know when like the other agent like has a grasp, and you can also like do more like advanced like stacking routines. So just so like the basic formulation of this. We're more or less trying to find like a mapping between like positions and torques on the object. So if you're given like a set of like various like positions, like placement positions, they're like each one of those like corresponds to like some sort of like wrench force that we can measure with like a wrist-mounted force torque sensor. And then that sort of just like reduces the problem down to like this optimization problem where we're trying to like set the torques to like a specific position. And if we're going for like a stable placement, you're trying to like zero out those torques. So basically what we need to do is like come up with some sort of like star, like given like this more like abstract problem. But like actually trying to do this in practice is like really challenging. So because like it's not actually clear how we would evaluate this function, because we don't actually use like a vision system to get like a full estimate of like the entire placement space. So you can't just like spend like forever like touching like every single point on the object to like actually like build out that model. So that's not going to work. So we have to like figure out how to deal with that. It's unclear, how like noise and error, like force torque sensors aren't the most like sensitive things in the world. So like having to like deal with that, and then actually like coming up with like the gradients, because like how are you actually gonna like move the object, like change your placement to zero out those torques. Those things like aren't really answered just like formulating it like that. So like to actually start like building this formulation, we make some assumptions. So the first assumption is that like the object that we have like actually picked up like remains like securely in grasp. So what we mean by that is like it doesn't like move like side to side. Like if you're like trying to place like a stick or something, and you come down, it doesn't just do that. So we assume that more or less we can like hold the object tightly enough so that if we come down, it's going to stay like level or like in like the same like position that we originally held it in. We also assume in this case that actions do not disturb the environment. This is an assumption we originally didn't want to deal with, but didn't really have the time to dive deeply into like if like the like bottom object like starts moving or starts tilting, like how to actually compensate for that. So for what we did, we just assumed that like the bottom object is going to stay like relatively static, and then we also assumed that like they're all rigid, so there's no like springing around or flexing. So to actually like evaluate the function, we basically like we come up with sort of like a guess, and we move that gripper to like that like Cartesian pose or like the initial guess that we come up with.
So in theory, that's how you would evaluate the subjective function, right? Because just for any p, you can evaluate the function f on said function, which we described earlier to define the wrenches, right? Just using the force torque sensor. However, just like sliding around between different poses to like explore the state space doesn't exactly work, because like as discussed earlier, right, we had these assumptions that we're not going to be disturbing our own object, we're not going to be disturbing like environment objects. So sliding, motion of even like acceleration of the wrist affects the force torque reading, and like actually the orientation affects the force torque reading because of it's a wrist mounted force torque sensor, and we have a bunch of like hardware mounted on the end. So essentially what we're doing instead is we're sampling these contact poses, and we have some, or the thought is that you'll have some heuristic to decide basically how are we going to go to what is the next pose based on what we've seen so far and what we're looking at right now.
So yeah, like a few more assumptions, like yeah, a lot of assumption slides. Basically, yeah, we assume that like the dominant forces are caused by like the grip approaching along the z-axis. So one thing that we could like potentially extend in the future is like if we're coming out at like different angles. But like as you're seeing like the live demo, we more or less just like come down from the top. So again, just like makes it like a much simpler problem. And then we just need to focus on like the torques in like the x and the y direction. So if you can like start imagining like if you have like a fork, like if this is like the positive x direction and you have like a torque this way, that means that like letting go of the object, it's gonna like start rotating around like that. I'm just using like the right hand rule. So basically, if you're gonna rotate like this, you want to move that contact point like over to like the this side of the object. So to like eventually like cancel out that torque. And the same thing applies in the y direction. And we basically assume that like when we're just like holding the object like statically, you just have gravity acting on it, and that pushing down like there's not going to be like any like springing effect or anything like that if we push down too hard onto like the bottom object, or the bottom object's not going to like collapse.
Okay, so let's talk about what we actually use as our heuristic to update these simple poses. So to do that, we're going to need to come up with a model of what is physically happening in this environment. So this is what our end effector looks like. We have a force torque sensor mounted at the wrist, a parallel jaw gripper, and an object held here. Now, when we're just holding it in the air, there's going to be, these are the forces that are main forces that are going to be active. Gravity is going to be pulling on the rock. Friction is going to be counteracting that pull on both jaws. And gravity is also going to be acting on our gripper, which we have to account for, as well as the opposite force of the friction. And these green arrows sum to the opposite of what we feel in our force torque sensor on the wrist. So this is without placement, just holding in the air. We get this force on the wrist sensor. And as long as we align it vertically down, this is not too bad. It's pretty simple. This one. But what happens when we actually try to place the rock? Well, if we start lowering the rock and we are not at a stable placement, we're going to start inducing torques. And the way that happens is when we exert force down onto the tower, it exerts a normal force back, which means we have to, this friction force becomes smaller because it has less weight to hold, but this friction force is going to become a little larger because we apply a torque to the rock, which is trying to rotate it. So just in the rock center mass frame, what this means is when we have a contact point with a normal force, that turns into a torque on the rock. And when we push harder, this torque gets bigger. And that's going to be important because when we just tried to do contacts, this torque was not enough to sense over the noise. So what we ended up doing is we tried to really press into the tower until we got a good reading. And yeah, and that's what happens to the rock, pretty much. I went wrong again. Okay, so let's analyze the math behind this. Here we have just a simplified model. We're just looking at the rock and a contact point on the tower. And we want to know, our question is, how do we find a new position given our sensor readings of force and torque? So what we do is we recognize that there's only three forces acting on the rock. We have gravity, which is acting on the center of mass pulling it down. We have, and we can calibrate this out when we're holding it in the air, like we saw in the first force diagram. Our second force is going to be the push from the arm, and we actually sense this directly with a force torque sensor. That's that orange brown one. And this essentially also acts on the center of mass. It's really on the two ends of the parallel jaws, but it comes out to being on the center of mass. And then we have the last force, which is the most important for us, which is the normal force from the tower. Now this one is not acting on center of mass, it's acting at some contact point, and we don't know it. It's not something we measure. Okay.
Yes. Wait, actually, I'm gonna go down in just a second, but if anybody has any object that's like vaguely this size that they'd like to participate in the stack, I don't know if you guys have seen like America's Got Talent, where they like, take something from the judges. But if you guys want something to be stacked, take up 6. All right, I'll be back. If it gets crushed a little bit, that's my bad. This gripper's kind of full.
Okay. So yeah, so this force is complicated because we don't know where the contact point is, and we don't know what the force vector is either. But we can figure it out. So once we press into the tower and we're in a stable, unmoving configuration, we know that the net force has to be 0 because the rock isn't moving. And if we calibrate out gravity and we measure the force of the robot pushing, we can just compute what the normal force has to be in order to make the net force 0. And furthermore, we measure a torque. We know that torque is the vector to the contact point from the center of mass across the normal force. And we can kind of reverse engineer this equation. If we measure the torque and we compute the normal force, we can try to compute R. And it's not exactly determined. We can compute the component of R that's perpendicular to the normal force. But that's actually not too bad because the space of vectors perpendicular to the normal force lies within the tangent plane to our tower surface. And that's really the plane that we care about. When we place an object, it's going to be contacting the tower. So if we want to update our placement, if we update our placement only along this tangent plane, that's perfect for us because that's where the rock is going to contact it next. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, so by measuring the force of the arm pushing and the torque, and we have to convert it to the rock weight, then we can figure out roughly where the contact point is, and we can figure out the normal force. Okay, cool. And that's pretty much good for what we need. But we have an additional analysis which will help us for more complicated surfaces. Before we just looked at where the contact point is and like how to relative to the center of mass. But suppose we also want to move, not just know where the contact point is, but know where the tower will be flat. Yeah, the tangent plane is not enough to know where the tower is flat because it's a plane. We care about curvature to know about flatness. So we need higher order information, and we don't really have that, or a way to get that without a bunch of samples. So what we do is we assume a little bit of convexity. If we place an object on a tower coming straight down, the first thing it's going to hit is going to be an extremity, most likely. So almost like 100% of the time, locally the tower is going to be convex around our contact points. If it's not, it's pretty hard, but also I also have trouble stacking non-convex rocks, so I'm not feeling about that. So if we assume it's convex, and we can compute this plane, this tangent plane by computing normal force, we basically we know that the surface is going to curve away from our normal vector in every direction. So we're going to pick the direction with the largest z component to be the direction where the curvature is probably steepest towards a normal vector that's in the z direction. So we use our previous computation of the normal force to find the tangent plane, and we pick the direction in the tangent plane that has the largest z component, and we believe that's going to be where the tower is going to be flattest. Yeah. Okay. There's some mess with converting the frames. We have the point of contact, we have the rock center of mass, and we are actually sensing at the wrist and not the rock center of mass. So there's conversions between forces and torques there, and there's a little bit of nasty details, but it's not too bad. And then we use our normal forward kinematics and wrist kinematics with the multi-joint robot to go from the wrist frame to the global frame, and in the end get outputs in joint space of how to make our motion adjustments. Yeah. Okay, so here's our algorithm all in all. We slowly we have an initial guess. We slowly press the rock into the tower, and we sense the torques and forces. Once we notice that the rock is pressing into the tower with large enough force, we use our math that we just did to find that R, the contact point relative to the center of mass, and then we can slightly lift the rock and move over the center of mass slightly lift in the rock so we don't disturb the environment, like we said. And we are going to pick the next contact point to be where the center of mass is over the last contact point. So this is one opposition procedure where we just move the center of mass over to the contact point every time, and eventually it should hopefully balance. And this worked great for us. But for more complicated objects, which we haven't tested very much yet, which are less flat, and we need to not only move the center of mass over to the contact point, but also find a contact point which would be flat. We can add this additional term, which is using not only moving in the direction of r, but adding another step size in the direction where we thought that the tower would curve to being flat. So the forces we can use, we use the normal force for that to find the flat spot, and we use the torques to, as well as the forces to compute r. And we combine these two. These would be combined together to find a new contact point. So these are two opposition procedures. This one has an extra term for more complex objects. Some complications we don't usually have much time to get into. But here are some results. These are 3 sample placements. Those are the center of masses of those placements, and the black is the true center of our tower. We tried pressing in these locations, and we measured the forces and torques, and then we used our calculations to compute r, the direction of the contact point where we should update our new placement. And we have those arrows plotted up there, and they're all pretty great. Since we had pretty flat objects and pretty strong forces, you can see this gets up to 10 newtons. It was pretty clear what direction we should update. And these, but yeah, and so this is really successful for our simple objects that can resist large forces.
This robot setup, which is on the floor, and essentially what's going to happen is we have pre set up pick and place points, and so essentially what's going to happen is the robot has no sensing other than the force torque sensor right here, and it's the UR5 robot. And essentially what's going to happen is it's going to be able to create a stack of objects simply by sensing where the last object is and by placing the next one on top of it. So I'm just going to take these little paper finger pads over the gripper, because what ends up happening is they end up getting, you'll see this later in the presentation, but they end up getting a little bit too sticky. And then the gripper like effectively grabs the object off of where it was intended to be placed. And then the stack obviously doesn't work. So this is actually incredibly slow. So I'll give you one, and then I don't know, we can either leave it on in the background, or because otherwise, yeah, it is slow. But I can give you as many stacks as you guys are willing to wait for. We have a couple more slides, obviously, but essentially, I'll overview the results while I'm here. Essentially, just stacking when you don't have to make any adjustments. It is, or I don't want to say it is 100% successful, because then it will definitely fail right now. But in the past, it has been 100% successful. So we're hopeful that will continue. We found some of the failure cases to be when you're trying to stack the objects and make adjustments. The assumption that the object doesn't move in the hand is is not fantastic, especially since we have to use these paper covers to not have the object slip away. So the third failure case, or major failure case, is when you're trying to place an object on like a ramp, for example, because essentially what you get is that the object thinks that it needs to move towards. Or I can actually give you a ramp. How's that? It needs to move down the ramp or up the ramp. Yeah, can you not hear me?
That's time.
Oh, that's the duck sound. Yeah, for sure.
Nice job. So I guess
anyway, yes, can't use ramps.
Questions while.
Yeah, while you questions, this thing will keep moving. I'll keep loading.
So I'm curious to know how this is, how this compares to current state-of-the-art methods that do pick and place and stacking.
There wasn't really some of the prior works we saw, especially with the rock stacking. I think they're pretty good. They get heights of 5 or 3 or 4 rocks maybe before one would topple. Unfortunately, we didn't actually ever end up using rocks. So we have a good way to see like if this could like get higher or like get a higher stack. I guess that would be like a really good like metric to use if you're to compare it, like in the rock stacking space. But yeah, we didn't really get like any like good comparison to some of the priorities.
So what are you stacking now then? Not rocks.
These are the shuffleboard pucks.
Oh, very good. Oh, I did
Yeah,
emoji. We love reducing the cycle.
because we need something like heavy enough that would like actually like give us good readings, like a good signal to noise ratio on the force torque sensor. And we wanted to start with like something that was like relatively flat and simple before we move like the more complex objects. So we get to more complex objects like ovoid rocks or anything like that. But that would be like our next step.
What is the texture like on the bottom and on the tops of the shuffleboard pucks?
So the bottom's like more or less like perfectly flat. The top
Oh, okay.
has
It's
like this
not.
weird like divots.
Plastic.
So it is very possible to like do this wrong. So if I put it here, it will totally just like slide off. How's that? It is not like, you know, a given.
So one of the feedback that you don't have vision, right? Or it's just force. You just try.
Yeah, just force. So originally we were going to use like vision to come up with like really rudimentary guesses. Like, you know, if we were to like segment out the object and like find out like center of like that segmentation, then like maybe that would be like our initial guess. But we were trying to avoid using like an entire like 3D map to like estimate like the center of mass based on like a 3D model of the object and then use that. Instead of we wanted to like try to do all that with like the force torque feedback.
And right now we just have smooth input.
Take this to the Dalai Lama. All these Buddhist monks, you know. So the quasi-static analysis was certainly good enough, and we had all the ads, all those ad drawings figured out. That's what that page was.
When we talked to the professor there, he said that we have trouble slipping, and we did. We found that we had to go up and down instead of over.
And that four-stroke sensor, who makes that four-stroke sensor?
This is the ATI Axia 80. Yeah.
How many?
Oh, yeah. The one slide that we skipped, sorry, is the thank you to Professor Baichi, Isabel Huang, and Alice Ratner for letting us use this equipment, because obviously this is not Sawyer.
Yeah, we've also like stacked just some random stuff in there.
How many pucks high can you stack?
This is 4 pucks on the bottom, plus the block, plus another puck, plus the tape roll. Basically what happened is not that it stopped stacking. Yeah, the problem was that I ran out of things to stack.
Yeah, I didn't bring all the pucks into the lab. So